In this clip, we will take a look at a variant of a hasty attack operation termed a close attack.
Close attack always requires that the participating units be assigned to a hasty attack operation, but like an overrun, a close attack is executed using a unique operation cycle that differs from the standard hasty attack operation cycle. During the commitment step, the active player declares that his hasty attack will be a close attack, which changes the cycle to be executed. He still declares the regiment or task force that will participate and names his objective hex. However, unlike an overrun, where the objective hex must be clear terrain, for a close attack, the objective hex must be close terrain. Moreover, it must be adjacent to at least one of the participating units, because only units that start next to the objective hex can participate in a close attack. During the movement step, any participating units that are not adjacent to the objective hex can use the normal movement rules for a hasty attack, except that no unit can move next to an enemy unit, although they are allowed to stay next to one if they don't move. Then, the participating units that are adjacent to the objective hex can all move into that hex, where they are placed on top of the defending units. Next, the defending units in the objective hex only execute defender point-blank fire. This fire is doubled, but remember that a unit's final modified fire strength can never be more than double its original basic fire strength, so defending infantry units in the hex can never be more than doubled after accounting for all fire effects. Note that there is no defensive fire call step. The game system does not allow a player to call fire down on himself. The close attacking units absorb any hits inflicted on them by this fire, using the terrain effects for defensive fire. Next, the attacker gets to fire back, but again only with his units actually in the objective hex, and there is no fire call step. This offensive fire is also point-blank fire, and thus doubled. Furthermore, the defender must absorb all hits by step loss. No retreat is allowed during a close attack, but the defending units absorb hits normally using the terrain effects for offensive fire. Note that if there is an improved position in the hex, then the defending units will benefit from it, but the attacking units will not. In the next step, things get interesting. The attacker must decide whether he will withdraw all of his surviving units out of the objective hex or keep them there for another round of point-blank fire. If he decides to withdraw, then his units can return to any of the adjacent hexes that attacking units started in, and play proceeds to the completion step. If he decides to stay in the objective hex, then the defender must now decide whether he wishes to stay or withdraw. If he decides to withdraw, his units can move to any adjacent hex that did not contain an enemy unit at the start of the operation, and does not now. The operation then ends with the completion step. If he too decides to stay, then another round of combat is fought. Unlike an overrun, where a fight to the finish is literal because neither side can withdraw, a close attack is a slower form of combat because of the nature of the close terrain it's fought in. So each side has a chance to withdraw during the fight or flight segment after each separate fire round. The fight to the finish cycle continues for a maximum of 5 fire rounds. If both sides still have units in the objective hex after 5 rounds of point-blank fire, then the attacker must withdraw and the operation ends. Otherwise, it ends whenever only one side has units left in the objective hex. And of course, the operation is always finished with the standard completion step.
To conduct a close attack, a number of conditions must be met. The objective hex has to be in close terrain. So that means that the objective hex must be town, city, heavy woods, or rough terrain, which is present in some other games such as Fifth Corps. The second requirement is that the units that participate in a close attack must be executing a hasty attack operation. The third is that only units that actually start the operation adjacent to the objective hex can participate. Other units might be included in the operation, but they must conduct their movement first, and then only the units that actually start adjacent to the objective hex will actually execute the close attack. Another requirement is that all of the participating units must be either infantry or engineers. On the infantry side, they can be mechanized infantry, they can be motorized infantry, they can be leg infantry, but they must be infantry. Ditto, any engineer can also participate if it's participating in the same hasty attack operation. There are a couple of things that bar a close attack. One of them is that you cannot close attack across a river hexide of any type, even a river hexide that contains a bridge. Another is that you cannot close attack up a slope. The reverse is not barred, so it's entirely possible for a NATO unit to execute a close attack down a slope. That is permissible. The final obstacle, if you will, to conducting a close attack is an obstacle or a minefield. So if this hex contained a minefield or obstacle, or if the objective hex contained a minefield or an obstacle, then no close attack would be possible. All right, with this quick overview, let's do a deep dive into an actual close attack operation. Here, the 241st Guards Motor Rifle Regiment is executing its planned hasty attack. During the commitment step, the Warsaw Pact player declares that the objective hex is Poppenhausen, containing this mortar unit, and that the operation will use the close attack variant. During the movement step, he must first move any units that are not adjacent to the objective hex, and these units cannot be used to move adjacent to an enemy unit. So this unit here could move perfectly normally, 1, 1.5, 2.5, 3.5, 4. And as long as he isn't next to an enemy unit, he's good. Then the units that are actually adjacent to the objective hex get to move. So they enter the objective hex, and at this point the defender gets a defensive fire at point-blank range. So this is called defender point-blank fire. It's basically defensive fire doubled. The Martyr Company is also doubled for being infantry defending in a close terrain objective hex, but the rules state that you can be at most doubled once. So the Martyr fires with 3 times 1 step, doubled for a total of 6. Standard division by 2 brings that down to 3. The Warsaw Pact player will be defending with 4, which is 3 plus 1 for the close terrain. If there were an improved position in this hex, the NATO player would benefit from it, but the Warsaw Pact player would not. So firing with a base effective fire strength of 3, the NATO player rolls a 5, that inflicts 3 hits. The Warsaw Pact player is 3 plus 1 for attacking in a town hex, and so the 3 hits is insufficient to take a step. The Warsaw Pact player now fires back with 3 times 6 steps, or 18, doubled to 36, back to 18 by the standard division by 2. He rolls a 3, that inflicts 17 hits. The NATO player's defense strength is 3 plus 4 for the town, or 7. 17 is more than enough to claim 2 steps, or a step and a retreat. However, no player can ever retreat out of a close attack, and so this claims the West German unit, and it is therefore eliminated, and the close attack is terminated, meaning the operation is concluded. A couple of things obtain here. One is that had the NATO unit actually survived in this hex, after that first round of fire, then something called the fight or flight step occurs. This means that the active player first has the opportunity to withdraw all of his units from the hex and put them back into any hex that was occupied by a participating unit at the start of the operation. So the Warsaw Pact player could say, hey, this is too tough a target, I'm going to back out. If the active player does not do that, the inactive player would have an option to do that. So the NATO player could retreat into any hex that was not occupied by a Warsaw Pact unit at the start of the operation. If neither player elects to withdraw, then another round of fire is fought. Defensive fire doubled, offensive fire doubled, and then there's another fight or flight step. This continues for 5 rounds of fire. If at the end of 5 rounds of fire both players still have units in the hex, then the attacker, the active player, must withdraw any surviving attacking units into one of the hexes that had attacking units at the start of the operation, and that would conclude the combat. Another nuance is that just like an overrun, neither side can make a fire call during a close attack operation. Just the units that are actually in the objective hex get to fire. And that's how a close attack operation is run.